I want to say I was gutted when I first heard that the Gaelic talk was not happening, because I'm such a big fan of basically minoritized languages in general. Thank you, Richard, for that word. I love the word minoritized, not minority. But then I realized maybe I could sort of make up for that by talking about Welsh. And then I realized that I'm going to be the last talk, and this is sort of a downer of a presentation. I'm afraid I'm going to leave a bad taste in your mouth because of how depressing it is. But this is something I'm quite passionate about, so I thought I'm going to do it anyway. So first of all, who am I? Am I qualified to talk about this? First of all, I'm first and foremost a composer. I'm studying a PhD in composition, but you're not interested in that. I've been running a language blog since 2015 and doing a YouTube channel since the lockdown, basically. And then I run a Cantonese podcast called Soyin Kwangso alongside my YouTube channel Rhapsody in Lingo. I am a native Cantonese speaker, which makes me not a native speaker of the languages two of the languages I'm going to talk about. But I am sort of a language activist to write more Cantonese, basically. And this is actually my first time speaking in one of these in-person polyglot events, so this is quite exciting. Disclaimer, as I said, most of this I'm going to talk about. I'm not qualified to talk about it. I got this from my experience learning these languages and loving them. And I got this from the stuff I've read and interactions I've had on online communities mainly, because it's not easy to find speakers in real life of these languages. And because of the nature of these sources, especially Twitter, my perspective may be skewed. So just in case, if you have something else to add, feel free to do it after the talk, if you're more familiar with how the things actually are. So let's get into it. First of all, thank you to Charlotte and Emily for doing the talk yesterday so that I don't have to go through this again. Just got 2 lines here. Welsh is a Brythonic language, and the important number is that currently around 17% of Wales speaks the language. Their goal is around a third of the country, 1 million people by 2050. So this is around half of their eventual goal. But even when they reach the goal, it is still a minority language inside Wales, even though it is a relatively successful one by that metric. So what does Wales have to do with me? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Unless you count the fact that I was born in the Prince of Wales Hospital in Hong Kong. But a little birdie told me that Welsh people aren't really fond of that fellow, so never mind that. I've been learning a bit of Welsh very casually since 2021, initially only because I liked the language. I had actually just moved to Manchester back then, which is quite close to North Wales, where you can find relatively more Welsh speakers. So I thought, might as well give that a try, and upon the recommendation of a friend. And then, al hyn o bryd yn siarad tipyn bach o Gymraeg. Dwi wedi bod yn dysgu'r iaith yn ddifrifol sawl mis, neu llai nag 1 flwyddyn. Ond dwi wedi defnyddio'r lawer yr iaith mewn bywyd go iawn, dim ond unwaith mewn gwirionedd efo Richard yma. And now you all know how it feels to be that 83% of Wales. And through this process, I was exposed to the communities of learners and users, and I learned about what it means to this people, to the country, and especially to who they are. And at that moment, I felt like this is all a bit familiar. Afterwards, I found out about this book by James Griffiths, a Welsh journalist in Hong Kong, who wrote a book called Speak Not, Empire, Identity, and the Politics of Language. So he first and foremost talked about Welsh. If you are not familiar with what the Welsh Not is, which is what inspired the title of the book, the Welsh Not is a thing that schools used back in the day to literally beat the language out of the kids, because it's sort of a sign or something like that that kids would wear whenever they were caught speaking Welsh in school or outside of school. And then whoever spoke Welsh would get the sign from the previous child, and then at the end of the day, whoever had the sign will be brutally beaten. So actually some kids would try and sneak into other kids' homes to catch them speaking Welsh and give them the Welsh Not. That is, as I said, a bit of a downer. And then James Griffiths also compared it with Hawaiian, because they have a sort of similar trajectory of being oppressed, and most surprisingly, he added Cantonese into the mix, which really caught me off guard, and that was the main reason I bought it, actually. So it doesn't make sense, because when compared to Welsh and Hawaiian, Cantonese is a very healthy language. It's got more speakers than, I don't know, German or Italian in the world. It's doing quite well for its own, and people are speaking in daily life and in family, and so on. But apart from the fact that James worked in Hong Kong, that's probably his reason for doing so, he made a relatively convincing argument that Cantonese is just earlier on a trajectory, on a life cycle of oppressed languages. Because when you look at the history of oppressed languages like Welsh and Hawaiian, you see recurring patterns of what was going to happen. And then with Cantonese, you can see the same things on the horizon. They're not here yet. That's why it's still a healthy language, but at the same time, you can see them coming. So eventually, that's his theory, it's going to go through the very same things that these other languages have gone through on the other side. So this is the book that inspired this talk. But I don't know much about Hawaiian, so I took it out and added something else to the mix, which is Taiwanese, or in Taiwanese, it's called Daiyi. First of all, what is Taiwanese? It is a Chinese language, or if you want a less politically charged word, it's a Sinitic language. It is under a branch, and you might know that Chinese languages are actually very diverse. And so Taiwanese came from the branch called Hokkien. In Hokkien, that's called Hokkien Wei. In Mandarin, that's called Fujianhua, which is in the sort of southeast coast of China, Fujian. That is where we got fucking fried rice from. So a few centuries ago, they migrated over to the island of Taiwan and then developed independently. And because of the Japanese colonial period, they got a lot of Japanese influence. You might think that Japanese is very incompatible with Chinese phonology, but it turns out it works quite well. Japanese words work really well in Hokkien. That's why in Taiwanese they have a lot of Japanese words, and through Japanese they also have English, Portuguese words, and so on. And currently in Taiwan, 73% of the Sinitic population, whatever you interpret that to be, some people say Han, they are ethnically Hokkien. That is the majority of the population there, but notice that I said ethnically, not linguistically, because currently everyone speaks Mandarin, basically. And 12% is Hakka, which is another Chinese language. So I was actually telling Lenny earlier, it is a quite common rebuttal you get from Mandarin speakers. Whenever you try to speak Taiwanese, they're like, but I'm Hakka, why would you speak Taiwanese to me? But then they don't speak Hakka, so it's just like an excuse to stop people speaking Taiwanese. And currently in Taiwan, I think the older generations you find more native speakers. And then the adult generation are brought up in Mandarin. They would understand some degree of Taiwanese. And then the younger generation, they'd have very little exposure to the language, except through their grandparents. So they would have heard some phrases. And nowadays, in current day Taiwanese Mandarin, you have a lot of set phrases in Mandarin, but from Taiwanese language. So usually it's some short phrases, some exclamations, expressive things, including but not limited to swear words. And let's look at this picture here. So if you know what the Welsh knot is, this might look familiar because this is the exact same thing. It's the same thing all over the world. You get a sign saying, I should not speak dialect, which is the word for not Mandarin. That's thanks to the National Party back in the day. And I do need to preface this. What is how Chinese writings work? So normally in any place where you find someone speaking a Chinese language, they always write in Mandarin Chinese. It's called standard written Chinese, but it's basically Mandarin with minor variations. So can you write written Taiwanese? Yes, of course, you can write any language you want. So there are 5 ways of writing Taiwanese, and that's going to be a problem later. The first one is a conventional set of Chinese characters that is enshrined in dictionaries, but hardly anyone knows now. The second one is a version by the Taiwanese Ministry of Education, which is etymologically correct, which means if you have a cognate in Mandarin and Taiwanese, it's going to be the same character. So that's why occasionally it looks almost like Mandarin. And again, that's going to be a problem later. The third one is called Beiredi. That is a Latin script, not a romanization, not auxiliary. It is a script by missionaries back in the day. And then the revised version by, the Ministry of Education. And then the last one is the one that gets on everyone's nerves, because it is approximation in Mandarin of the sounds of Taiwanese. So it's like people who think Chinese characters only have one pronunciation. They hear Taiwanese, they want to express it, but their only tool is using some words that sort of sound similar in Mandarin. But I would have to say that it is the most popular way to write Taiwanese. But outside of the set phrases that I said earlier, you can write phrases of like 4 or 5 syllables. You can't write an entire sentence in this sort of script. Let's skip this, because I know most of you know something about Chinese already. So let's go to the crux, the main part of this presentation, which is phenomena I've noticed from learning these minoritized languages. First of all, the problem of what is a mother tongue. Because for majority languages like English, simple. The mother tongue is the one you speak since you were born, or you were brought up in the language, or it's your parents' language, something along those lines. Well, at least in Taiwan, that word, which literally means a mother tongue, a mother language, Bergi, it means something quite different, because I think it means something more like your ancestral language. So when they say your mother tongue is Taiwanese, for example, you might actually not speak a lick of Taiwanese. It's just your grandparents' language. So whenever you say you are learning Taiwanese, you are relearning your mother tongue, which is a very non-intuitive thing to say. And then there's a thing of national language. And it's a weird word because, funny story. So I was doing some clothes master the other day, not sponsored. And then it gave me a word, I think it's język narodowy, and it made me translate it, it made me translate from mother tongue to język narodowy, which means national language. And I was like, no, your mother tongue doesn't have to be the national language. You can have a different language from your national language. But there's so many problems surrounding these terms. Like in Wales currently, the majority only speaks English. Why is Welsh the language of Wales? So it gets a lot muddier whenever you come to minority languages like this. And then we get to the more depressing part, which is the history. For both Welsh and Taiwanese, you had the same top-down sort of politics to uproot and replace the entire native tongue of the population. So as you saw, the Welsh not and its equivalent in Taiwan, that was literally physical beating. And then you have economic incentives. So when you get more opportunities by using the majority language, of course you give up your mother tongue eventually. Or maybe some parents intentionally don't speak their own language to their children. And when you come to current day, which is past all that politics and history, now both languages are neighboring the two of the biggest languages in the world, the English language and the Mandarin language. So they have a lot of cultural incentive to integrate into those larger languages. But when you look back in time, back before all that politics stuff happened, foreigners who went to those places always learned the local language. When people moved to Wales back in the day, they learned Welsh to talk to the miners, or other industrial workers. And this is I don't know how to pronounce it, Sekalu or something. It's a show in Taiwanese, actually in all the non-Mandarin Taiwanese languages, about a period in Taiwanese history that is 18 something. So you could see that people were learning the local language when they moved to the island, and they were communicating using their own languages in whatever means that worked, so they learned each other's languages. That was a beautiful multilingual paradise. But of course, when you get more and more foreigners speaking the majority language, well, the culturally strong language, it becomes harder to justify not switching especially when they outnumber the native population. And if you look at the current statistics, I can translate all that for you. First one is the first language you use, the main language you use at home, what language you speak to your children, what language you speak to your partner, your parents, your siblings, and then at work. So you see that when your mother tongue is any of the non-Mandarin languages, you might still use it in some situations, but not all. But if your main language is Mandarin, you're going to use it everywhere. So like there is more and more motivation. It's like a constant cycle. You get more motivation to switch over. And so second observation is the linguistic changes. So for one, language change is always inevitable. It always changes. But in these languages, you can notice that there are a lot of influence from the majority language. The fun part is Welsh because it got a lot of interesting sounds from English. You got the j, you have joyo, you got the ch, you could say China for China. And then the grammar is sort of switching a bit. It's losing the losing the VSO word order eventually. And then the depressing part is Taiwanese because it's losing some very interesting sounds. Because Taiwanese or Hokkien in general is one of the fewer languages in the Chinese family that has sounds like z, b, g. You don't get these in Mandarin. So for example, you have zua, you have beibai, daigi. Currently, speakers of Taiwanese, I think half of them can't say these sounds anymore. And other examples are below. And then, obviously, apart from changing language, you have mixing languages. So this word got quite popular among language circles last year. So that's what Ukrainians call the mixture of Ukrainian and Russian. And I looked up Wikipedia, and it can mean any mixture of languages. So I used it here. So sometimes people would code switch between the majority and the minority language. It's like flipping a switch. When I watch some Taiwanese TV, it's incredible because you can see them talking, and then halfway through a sentence, it's like someone's flipped a switch, and then they're in Mandarin for like 2 sentences, and then they realize, oh my God, why am I speaking Mandarin? And then they switch back, and it's just a weird phenomenon, and also quite impressive. Or more commonly, you have just mixing in different words. So when I watch Welsh TV, basically anything that's like slightly more sophisticated, they're going to switch to English, just one word. For example, the word sophisticated, or some deeper emotions that they haven't learned the word for in Welsh. Because even if they did their education in Welsh, there's much more media, there's much more books in English, and that's why they learn some of the more sophisticated things in English. And also because the phonological systems between the majority and minority languages are relatively similar, so they could mix it in without too much trouble or calling attention to the word. So that begs the question whether that harms the richness of the vocabulary of Welsh, for example. Because if you read books, the words are still there. They are in dictionaries. But when they speak the language in daily life, they're not using the potential of the language to its fullest. So if you look at current day, if you ask the speaker of the majority language, which in most cases are monolingual, they would be very annoyed at the existence of the minority language. Because when you say, we want language equality, we want language rights, people feel like you are imposing your small language on the larger majority, and you're shoving it down their throats. So if you are being activist, you are radical, you are politicizing. But if on the other hand, you are just fighting against the minority, then you just make sense, because that's the logical thing to do. So you see words thrown around a lot, saying the language is useless, it is outdated, it is uncultured. This word is very commonly used to describe Taiwanese. It literally means a low-ranking or inferior language. It's surprising that these kind of words are still seen nowadays, and maybe a nuisance as well. For example, there is this one guy, you can call him an activist. He made a sworn oath never to speak Mandarin again in his life, and he's in Taiwan. So currently in Taiwan, the situation is that most people understand Taiwanese to some degree. So he sort of can get by, but at the same time is going against the path of least resistance, because you can just easily do what you want to do using Mandarin. Why would you want to make it more difficult for everyone in question? And if you want to argue against that, they always have the upper hand, because it is always easier to use just the bigger language. Everyone understands it very well. And then when you use a minority language, people say you're excluding people because not everyone understands it. So this is a situation in Taiwanese parliament when someone decided to use Taiwanese, and then people are complaining and they have to find someone to translate it. That wouldn't happen in Wales, I think. They have good system to allow that. And then there's the other thing about place names. So people might be very familiar. When people go to a place, they want to have a nice holiday there, but they can't say the place names. Place names are hard, I admit. They're not making an effort. So there's this place I've been to. It's called Betusakoid, but everyone says Betsy Coed because it sounds like a person's name. Another person's name is Erwin, when it's actually Hirwine. And then the popular beach destination, Sandidno. So if you just ask someone, they will tell you at least. Even if you can't say the slur, the U is a E. Oh, just E. E if you're from South Wales. It's not dud. Only English would say dud. And in more recent news, people will be very familiar. This is in November last year. Snowdonia changed its name. Well, it didn't change its name. It dropped the English name, the colonial name, and it is now Eruri. And then Snowdon, the peak is called Erwidva. And just last week, another national park dropped the English name. And of course, guess how people reacted. I'm going to skip telling that story because you can guess. Even worse is this story that I've seen. People are complaining that having road signs in 2 languages makes driving more dangerous. Wow. I mean, most of the world has at least bilingual or trilingual road signs. Apparently, we are crashing our cars every single day. But this is actually a viewpoint that is expressed by the Telegraph itself, not just one person. It's a big newspaper. But let's look at slightly uplifting things. Mass media has pretty much been undergoing revitalisation. That's as much as I can say, because both Welsh and Taiwanese have had a very long literary heritage. This is the first Bible in Taiwanese. Again, of course, that was written by the missionaries. And since then, there have always been newspapers and publications and literature in the script for Taiwanese until Mandarin took over. Similar situation for Welsh, because they have a very long literary heritage, especially poetry, as far as I know. But nowadays, I think they're coming back. So a lot of books are popping up. Oh, Welsh, obviously, for a longer time, but in Taiwanese as well, you see more and more books. I find that people are surprisingly fond of poetry, which unfortunately I'm not an expert in. But lots of ordinary people without much training are doing poetry, possibly because it feels more accessible when everyone is equally not very good at the language. You feel like you can do something artistic with the language. And most importantly, in the modern era, you have public broadcasters once again. So in the 80s, you have Espedwarec in Wales, and it's a very good channel. I wholeheartedly recommend it. And then Taiwan, everything's a bit later in Taiwan. In the 2000s, you have Gongsu Daigi Tai or PTS Taigi. So that is, again, a public broadcaster. So the government is sort of doing a U-turn, helping out the languages. Another thing, it's a bit of digression because I enjoy learning these languages a lot. But the hardest thing about these languages is that you just don't have the resources, whether it's reading resources, learning resources, teachers. You have like one teacher on italki that you can rely on. And also, native speakers tend to be less savvy with the ins and outs of language. So whenever I had Taiwanese lessons, I asked the teacher something, she would just say, I don't know, this feels right, this is how my grandma says it, so go look it up yourself. But I know they try their best. A while ago, I wrote a blog post, and I got some heat for it, because I discussed the problem that Welsh learning resources sort of lack a lot of post-beginner resources, and everything is very centralized on the official course. It's like Duolingo is based on that same course, and like you can find many different course books which are also based on the same course. Yeah, people didn't like that article, but I still stand by it. I think that you can do much better, especially when you have TV series and you have subtitles, but the subtitles don't match what they're saying. So if you could make them match, you could make it much easier for learners. Now, next part. There are some quite differences. Apart from the fact that Welsh did the revitalisation a bit earlier than Taiwanese, you have a slightly different attitudes. I think there is some hostility coming from the users of languages in general, because we're very justified, I think. So in Taiwanese, I think just speakers of minority languages are more likely. They have a tendency to become activists because of the situation. Taiwanese speakers are usually very angry at Mandarin speakers because the situation is more complicated with the Chinese characters. So they have a term, hua nao lang, which is people with a Chinese brain. So basically, anyone doesn't think normally. Welsh is relatively welcoming because I think there is a more widespread belief that it is a language that you can learn, because there's more and more people learning the language as an adult. So people are aware that it is something that you can do, whereas Taiwanese, I think, much like Scots, is pretty much thought to be something that you can only learn from your parents, not something that you study. Next thing is visibility. So when I was in Cardiff for the first time ever, I noticed everything was bilingual. I mean, I knew that already, but I saw that with my own eyes, and that was very refreshing, especially in this country. And then when you look at, like, for example, this department that I worked with earlier, they always post in Welsh first and then English second. They are very aware to make Welsh more visible and shove it in your face, whether that's a good or a bad thing. And that's actually doing very good things for the language health. And whereas on the other hand, because of how the Chinese script works, Taiwanese is in quite a big trouble. As I said, Chinese script mainly writes meaning, not sound. So first of all, you have the people writing Taiwanese by approximating it with Mandarin sounds, and that is very inconducive to communication in general. And then some people are not even aware that you can write Chinese characters for Taiwanese. So there was a Facebook commenter that went viral a while ago, quite recently, because they were absolutely surprised when they found out that a Mandarin word and its Taiwanese cognate just happened to have the same sound. Like, wow, the sound matches the meaning. This is amazing. Whereas people who have read Taiwanese for a long time know that it's a normal thing. So just imagine if people wrote this. Oh, sorry, this is just Manx. I'm sorry. No, just imagine if people wrote that instead of the Welsh script. And there's a typo there as well, Kreuzko. That wouldn't be very good for communication, I think. Whereas from the Mandarin speakers, they mostly look down on people who use the Taiwanese phonetic script. They call them Tai Le. Tai Le is the name of the script, so people who use the script. Even though these people are the minority of the minority. So they say they are trying to turn Taiwanese into English because everything that is in Latin script is automatically English. And the thing is that it doesn't make sense. And most importantly, what is inclusiveness? So if you use the minority language, are you being more inclusive or are you being less inclusive? You could argue that you're more inclusive of the minority but you're less inclusive towards the majority. So you always see these words thrown around, and usually in Taiwan you see the latter. So people complain that you're excluding the majority, whereas the Welsh government is doing a relatively good job. It includes Welsh in everything. So as Richard said earlier, you could call a line in Welsh and you skip the entire English language queue. So you have the right to use your language. Yeah, there's a slogan, I think, Mai Geni Hau. So you have a right to use it. Again, the government is leveling the playing field a lot. Sorry, these slides are a bit all over the place because they were made in short notice. The Welsh government makes sure that almost everything is bilingual. Sometimes it's just lip service, because I've seen lots of people saying, oh, we have to put it in Welsh, this is extra money and time. And sometimes you get the errors. For example, that one that says alcohol for free. And then this is I think Welsh people would know that. This says, okay, you know that already. So I'll try to translate anyway. So no entry for heavy goods vehicles, blah, blah, blah. And then the Welsh says, I'm not in the office right now, please send the words to be translated. On the other side, if you look at Taiwan, they are currently doing a policy. This is very new, like from this year, last year. Called 享誉国家. Sorry, shouldn't use it in Mandarin. 双语国家. So it's called 2030 Bilingual Nation. They want to make Taiwan bilingual. Okay, that's fine. So what language do you want? English, obviously. That's a whole different story. And then what's the other one? They never said what the other language was. So people were asking. So they keep pressuring the government to say what the other language is. And the government won't say, because it is very heavily implied that it is Mandarin, because it is a de facto lingua franca. It is the language that everyone knows. But at the same time, you have 20 national languages in Taiwan. It could be any of them. It could be one of the Formosan languages that were even more severely oppressed. And if we look at education, Wales is doing quite well. 15% of the people are in Welsh medium education. 10% of people are in bilingual education. And then everyone has to learn some Welsh, even though they end up not speaking it. So that is successful to a degree, whereas in Taiwan, you get nothing. Just nada. Because, it is a spoken language, not a written language, as they say. So the last question is it inevitable for language to change? Because even if revitalisation is successful, this is going to change the language for good. That is something that I heard on Story Iaith, a very good program. For example, Welsh is getting even more different types of Welsh, because people, originally they have a lot of dialects already, and then some people are learning it as an adult. That is creating a new kind of learner Welsh. There is a new Cardiff Welsh, because people are moving in and mixing their dialects. So some people say, this is my Welsh, because your version of it, and it reflects your journey, your taith iaith. So that it's going to become a more personal thing. So some people are more welcoming of it. Of course, some people would be more conservative and say, now we've got to do the literary Welsh and say everything properly. Whereas in Taiwanese, I think they tend to be more conservative in general. They are trying to recover their heritage language, because they're more aware that this is my grandparents' language. So they keep thinking, okay, how would my grandma say this? How would my grandpa say this? My agong ama. And if they can't think of that, they would go to a Facebook group and ask, what's the proper way to say this? And if this were Cantonese, we would be very happy to use the cognate of the Mandarin word, because we are a relatively healthy language. But because Taiwanese is threatened, they keep finding new ways to avoid using cognates of Mandarin words. So sometimes they find some really old words, or they try to avoid anything that's a calque or that's a code mix. So there's a dichotomy between promoting language change or resisting it. So with the remaining time that I have, I'm doing relatively well, something that I'm actually qualified to talk about. It is whether Cantonese is going down the very same path As I said in the beginning, James Griffiths argued that Cantonese is just on the other end of that same journey, the same type. And you can see it going through the same things that Welsh and Hawaiian went through a long, long time ago. So, Cantonese is currently quite healthy. We have a lot of code mixing. Because it's Hong Kong, it was a British colony, we love our English words. Loan words are one thing, code mixing is another. And I did my education in English, that's why we code mix even more. And currently, so Cantonese is actually the language that overtook other languages. Hong Kong used to be a very linguistically diverse society, but now we are mainly Cantonese speaking. But this is not because of any governmental policy, which I think makes the most difference between the scenarios. It is just a natural development, homogenization of the languages. So if you look at the same trajectory that we had earlier, first of all, we have education. So we had the government suppressing Welsh and Taiwanese earlier with beating and everything. Thankfully, we don't have that anymore. We are in a quite civilized era without much physical violence. But the thing is, the Chinese subject was always a weird existence because, as I said, in any Chinese language, you write in Mandarin Chinese. So they had the perfect justification to just ignore the existence of Cantonese, and we did reading and writing in standard written Chinese, aka Mandarin, and also they just don't bother to teach you anything about your mother tongue. So I was recently in a, Facebook debate of whether Hong Kongers know about the 6 tones, and I said, well, it's not in the curriculum, so teachers don't bother teaching it. But it's like a fundamental thing about your language. It's like English teachers not teaching you what a vowel is. And that is just so bizarre, but it's just how it is what it is. And I think as native speakers, we have a responsibility to know at least some basic things about our language. And the next thing is a thing called Po Gao Zhong, which is teaching Chinese using Mandarin or Putonghua. So that is a thing on top of the thing I just said earlier about teaching written Mandarin. So now we used to pronounce the text in Cantonese, and then now on top of that, they're switching that to Mandarin as well because they think that makes you a better Chinese user. Currently, around 70% of primary schools and 36% of secondary schools have at least one class all in Mandarin, and 16% of primary schools, 2% of secondary schools only teach Chinese in Mandarin in Hong Kong. And this is, again, fresh off the press. In 2023, the public exam in Chinese, which would have been right now as we speak, was scrapped. So there's no more oral Chinese exam. So that was the only chance in the public exam where we could use Cantonese practically. And now it's gone. It's just reading, writing, listening. So note that you could always choose to use Mandarin, but now they're taking the only chance for you to actually speak Cantonese so that it's more inclusive again. And this is just Hong Kong. So if you look at other places in mainland China, of course, it's much worse. We are like I don't want to talk ourselves up like a shining beacon of Cantonese because we are doing relatively well. We were relatively free of the pressure from Mandarin until more recently. And then you see the same things again. So ever since around the 2000s, some parents have started speaking English and or Mandarin to their children and dropping Cantonese altogether. Again, because we're a British colony, and then now we are something in China. So we have the pressure that both Welsh and Taiwanese have experienced. So you could just pick your poison. Do you like English or Mandarin? Just anything, but give up your mother tongue. And of course, both English language and Mandarin language culture are very strong, especially where we are. So young people are starting to adopt some slang terms from Mandarin. Earlier, when we did that, around 10 years ago, I sound old now, we would have calculated, which is what I call using the Cantonese equivalent of a Mandarin term. But now I see a more increasing tendency to just use the Mandarin term without changing it into Cantonese. And if you look at the once very successful Hong Kong film industry, now they are almost always collaborating with Chinese film companies. And guess what language they speak in those collaborations? And even worse is the younger generations, the actual kids, they are increasingly speaking Mandarin in school, after school, among themselves because of the cultural and the educational influence. And you start to see the native language confined to the home. And that might sound very familiar if you listen to what I said earlier. So there is a more of this harmony between the different language groups. Earlier, people were very happily speaking each other's languages. For example, when an immigrant came to Hong Kong, they would learn our language, or when we welcome visitors, we would use their language for hospitality. And now it's there's more friction between different groups. So this is, again, recent news because we recently reopened to Chinese visitors and people started coming over and doing some social experiments. For example, this person tried to just speak Mandarin all day long, and then she claims to experience some sort of discrimination when it's just people who don't speak Mandarin very well. And in their eyes, because you're part of a country, you should naturally be able to speak this language very well. And another similar case, and this poster wants to remind you that you are part of our country, and hence you should be able to speak our language, as if that wouldn't take time to happen. And admittedly, there is hostility from both sides because I increasingly hear people saying, "Yeah, I don't speak your language, so what? Just don't come." And that is worrying because there's this harmony between both sides, and that is just going to lead to increasing friction. And so if you know the stereotype about Welsh speakers, it's when you walk into the pub, they always instantly switch to Welsh from English because apparently they can sense that you don't speak Welsh and they don't want you to understand them. So that is something that Hong Kongers seem to actually want to do. So again, everything very familiar. And we get to more political stuff. In Hong Kong, we have more and more self-censorship in all facets of daily life. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about linguistic censorship. The censorship is increasingly rampant. What's scary is that it's self-censorship and not top-down censorship, because people are afraid of offending the censors, and they decide to use Mandarin in more and more cases. And because of what we went through politically, even writing Cantonese seems to be subversive. So you have to judge what you're writing to and what situation you're using the language in order to decide what language you use. And in terms of spoken language, this is from 2016. That was probably one of the earlier times when someone swore in as a parliamentarian in Mandarin. And this parliamentarian is very proud of it. He says, "This is our national language, and we need to use it for our oaths." And in 2022, 6 years later, it increased to 3, and let's see how it goes afterwards. So my last question about these observations is, does the linguistic proximity increase threat? Because on the one hand, you see that in Scotland, Scots is, well, arguably under more pressure from English because it's seen as bad English, whereas Gaelic is objectively a different language. But at the same time, in Taiwan, you see the Sinitic languages, Taiwanese and Hakka, and the Formosan languages, which are Austronesian languages, receiving the same level of threat from Mandarin. So it's not necessarily the case, it's just different kinds of pressure. So what can we learn from this? First of all, change is inevitable. But the question is, how much would you let it change? Because if you stop it from changing, the only other way it could go is it disappears. But at the same time, if you let it change, how much does it have to change for it to be a completely different language? So this is a question of preservation or promotion. So a lot of people have been talking about language preservation. A friend of mine is very strongly against that term because it implies fossilizing the language, put it in a tin can, or making it something just a formality, only something that just the government uses. But on the other hand, he recommends promoting the language, especially when it's not yet at the endangered level yet. So all you can do is you developed your language, you make it even healthier, you use it in more situations. Especially, I saw a video a long time ago. This is in 2020, yeah. So I saw a video by the Speak Hokkien campaign in Penang, Malaysia, about what Chinese means. And that is an overtly political video. I translated it into Cantonese and English, but what I want to focus on is the end of that video. It says, or the TLDR is, the only way to restore or promote the status of your language is to add the utility. So make sure that it's not just something you speak, not just something in your home. Allow the language to populate more and more domains of everyday life. Use them in literature, use them in your signs, your everything, your online posting, your offline newspapers. That's the only way to stop the cultural calamity. And I have some other suggestions to prevent this calamity. So, again, this brings me back to what Thomas Bach says. Scotland somehow has an intense hostility towards its own languages. So we need to promote a positive image of your language in order to prevent it from going down that very same path. And you maximize the number of domains where you can use the language. For example, people never thought that you could write literature in Cantonese, but people are doing it now because what was once a fringe thing on the internet is starting to become published, starting to become in literary magazines. I just said I'm not a poet, but I actually wrote a poem. It was because I wanted to write an art song as a composer. I wanted to write an art song in Cantonese, and I couldn't find a poem that is actually in Cantonese that I like, so I wrote my own. And I never thought I could do that either, because what people used to do was to use poems written in standard written Chinese and sing it in Cantonese. So we need to vitalize the language before it is time to revitalize it. And you see some positive changes in other parts, in other languages that I mentioned. Very recently, there is a successful rapper in Taiwan who actually raps in a variety of languages, and most importantly, Taiwanese. And that sort of ignited some interest in Taiwanese once again. And in the case of Welsh, I think last week, there's the first Welsh language series on Netflix. I recommend it. It's called Dalemest. So it is, again, from S4C, the Welsh TV channel, and Netflix. They had so much confidence in the show that they bought it. This is an Amahid that is a very popular folk song that is being sung all over football stadiums. I don't know anything about football, but I know the song is a very good one because it represents what the Welsh language and the Welsh people are. They have experienced a lot of oppression from different sides, but they are still here, which is what the title of the song means. I also find it quite moving. And in different diasporas, we are starting to see news being promoted and produced, despite the difficulty of using the languages in their own native land. And most interestingly, in France, at least according to this documentary, you see a surprising number of Taiwanese language families. And in Taiwan, it's getting harder and harder to find that, but in France, you have French-Taiwanese bilingual families. So that will be all from me. Thank you. Diolch, de xia, and doze. Just two more things to say. This is call for help because this is completely semi-related. I really want to make a poster of the map of the UK in Welsh, but I'm not very good at it. I can't draw and I can't find all the names. So if anyone can contribute, come to me. And the way you can do that is, most importantly, check out my YouTube channel. I talk about language learning and everything language. If you understand Cantonese, which I hope you eventually do, you can check out my podcast, 水言狂想, and my Twitter. Thank you very much again. That's all.